They didn't just kill their enemies. They performed their deaths. A king is dragged from his throne and made to crawl. A warrior is turned into a warning. A body becomes a message carved into history, so terrifying that even the Vikings whispered about it. Stay. Because the worst part isn't the blood. It's how calmly they did it. Viking history isn't only raids and glory. It's power bought with terror. Tonight, we uncover the most infamous recorded deaths tied to Viking-age politics, where execution wasn't justice. It was theater. And the crowd was the weapon. To understand the most terrifying Viking deaths ever recorded, you have to understand something colder than the sea they sailed. In the Viking world, death wasn't always an ending. Sometimes it was a statement. Power didn't sit safely on a throne. It walked on a knife edge, balanced between loyalty, revenge, and reputation. A ruler wasn't measured only by the land he held, but by what people believed he was capable of doing to those who challenged him. And no story captures that better than the downfall of King Ælla of Northumbria, the man Viking tradition remembers not just as an enemy, but as a target. Aella wasn't a Viking. He was an Anglo-Saxon king in northern England, ruling a fractured kingdom where alliances changed like weather. In the 9th century, Northumbria was a land of monasteries, walled towns, and political knives drawn in dark corridors. A place where a king could win a crown one season and lose his head the next. But Aella's name becomes legendary for one reason: Ragnar Lodbrok. Ragnar, half man half myth, was a symbol that spread like fire across the northern world. Viking sagas paint him as a raid leader of supernatural luck. A man who struck England and returned home with wealth and fame. Whether Ragnar existed exactly as told doesn't even matter. His story mattered. Because in the Viking imagination, Ragnar represented the idea that the sea itself could deliver justice. And the story says that Aella killed Ragnar. Not in battle. Not with honor. But by throwing him into a pit of snakes. That image, true or embellished, was enough to trigger something ancient and unstoppable. Because Vikings didn't only mourn. They answered. And when they answered, they did it in a way the world would never forget. Ragnar's sons, Ivar the Boneless, Ubba Halfdan and Bjorn Ironside, were more than angry sons. They were warlords shaped by a culture where reputation was inheritance. If the story of Ragnar's death was allowed to stand without consequence, it would poison their bloodline forever. So they gathered an army. Not a raid party. Not a few ships. An invasion. The Chronicles call it the Great Heathen Army, a coalition of warriors moving like a storm front across England. Not to steal gold and vanish. But to occupy, punish, and rewrite the rules. And in that storm, King Ælla becomes something worse than a target. He becomes an example. Because the Vikings didn't fear death the way their enemies did. Many believed a glorious end could open the gates of Valhalla. That belief made them terrifying in battle. But what made them truly dangerous was this. They understood that fear spreads faster than armies. So when it came time to kill a king, it couldn't be quick. It couldn't be private. It had to be unforgettable. History remembers names like Ælla not because they ruled well, but because of how they fell. And what their deaths taught the living. Ælla didn't inherit peace. He inherited a kingdom already cracking at the seams. Northumbria was not one nation with one heartbeat. It was competing bloodlines, rival nobles, and church power rising like a second crown beside the first. Kings rose fast. And they fell faster. Ælla climbed through that chaos with the kind of ambition that makes enemies before it makes allies. The records are thin, but the pattern is familiar: a ruler consolidating control through force. Removing rivals. Tightening authority. Demanding loyalty in a land where loyalty was always rented, never owned. In his halls, the fires burned high. His men drank and swore oaths. His messengers rode through cold rain with sealed commands. Ælla was a king who understood that mercy could look like weakness, and weakness could invite rebellion. Then came the sea wolves. Viking raids were already known along the English coasts. Monasteries had been stripped. Towns had been hit and abandoned. But those raids were flashes, violent and fast. Ragnar's story, however, wasn't a flash. It was an insult delivered personally. The saga tradition frames Ragnar as captured after a failed raid, brought before Ælla, and killed in a snake pit. Whether that exact method happened isn't the point. The point is this. The story spread. In a world without printing presses, stories were currency. They moved across oceans in the mouths of sailors. They crossed borders at the speed of rumor. And once a story entered Viking halls, once it was repeated over mead and firelight, it became real enough to demand blood. Aella, in that story, becomes a king who didn't just defend his land. He humiliated a legend. And to Vikings, humiliation was not a side effect. It was a crime. Still, from Aella's perspective, the threat might have seemed manageable. Raids came and went. Kings had weathered them before. Northumbria had walls. It had soldiers. It had alliances, at least on paper. But power has a blind spot. When you live surrounded by men who must agree with you to survive, warnings start to sound like exaggerations. Reports become panic. Messengers become cowards. And a king begins to believe the world will behave the way it always has. Then, one season, the horizon changed. Sails appeared, not a handful but many. Too many. The Great Heathen Army did not arrive like thieves. It arrived like conquest. Columns of warriors stepping onto English soil as if they already owned it. Their leaders weren't desperate raiders. They were strategists. They knew where to hit. They knew where kingdoms were weak. They knew how to make fear do half the work. And at the center of their purpose was Aella. Not because he was the greatest king in England, but because his death could become the loudest message. In Viking logic, killing Aella wasn't only revenge. It was proof. Proof that Ragnar's bloodline could reach through distance and time and still crush the man responsible. Aella's court would have felt the pressure like a tightening rope. Nobles watching the coastline. Priests praying harder. Soldiers standing a little straighter. Farmers whispering in markets. Because when Vikings came in numbers, they didn't just burn buildings. They burned certainty. Ælla had built his power on the belief that he controlled Northumbria. That belief was now under siege. And the more he fought to hold it, the more obvious the truth became. A king is only powerful while people believe he cannot be touched. The Great Heathen Army was about to touch him. The first battles weren't just clashes of steel. They were collisions of worlds. Northumbria faced an enemy that didn't fight like the raiders of old. The Great Heathen Army camped, fortified, negotiated when it benefited them, and attacked when it didn't. They weren't always rushing. They were staying. That changed everything. In England, political cracks widened under pressure. Every noble asked the same silent question: if the Vikings win, who survives? Because conquest doesn't only destroy kingdoms. It creates new opportunities for those willing to switch sides early. Aella's problem wasn't only outside his walls. It was inside them. Northumbria had suffered internal conflict even before the Vikings arrived. Rival claimants, shifting loyalties, bitter factions. A king in that environment doesn't rule through love. He rules through fear and favors, two tools that stop working the moment people sense the tide turning. And the tide was turning. The Vikings struck strategically. They took strongholds. They broke lines of communication. They pushed populations into panic. A terrified citizen is not loyal. A terrified citizen just wants the nightmare to end, no matter what flag flies afterward. Ælla would have called his war council. He would have demanded troops. Taxes. Food. Men pulled from farms and pushed into the shield wall. But each demand cost him. Every forced levy creates resentment. Every loss on the battlefield creates doubt. And doubt is deadly to a king. Somewhere in the pressure, betrayal begins, not always dramatic, not always obvious. Sometimes it's a noble who arrives late. A commander who misunderstands an order. A promised force that never appears. And sometimes it's something quieter. A door left unguarded. A messenger delayed. A rumor allowed to spread. Because Vikings didn't only conquer with blades. They conquered with psychology. They knew how to make a kingdom feel doomed before the final battle even began. The sources tell us that Ælla eventually met the Great Heathen Army in battle after they seized key positions, most famously, York. The details are debated, but the shape of the story is consistent. Northumbria fights back. And it fails. Not with a heroic last stand on a perfect field, but with confusion, desperation, and the sickening realization that the enemy has already anticipated your moves. Imagine the sound. Not just war cries, but the deeper sound of a kingdom breaking. The snap of discipline. The thud of retreat. The chaos of men looking over their shoulders instead of forward. Aella's soldiers would have felt it first. The moment the shield wall starts to loosen, the moment courage turns into survival instinct. And then, the worst moment for any ruler. The moment a king realizes his men are no longer dying for him. Because a king can survive being hated. He cannot survive being irrelevant. The Great Heathen Army didn't need Aella's people to love them. They only needed them to believe resistance was pointless. As the conflict sharpened, Aella's choices narrowed. Retreat and look weak, or attack and risk annihilation. Negotiate and risk humiliation, or fight and risk capture. And hovering over every decision was Ragnar's shadow. If Aella truly had Ragnar killed, then this wasn't just politics anymore. It was blood feud. And blood feuds don't end with treaties. They end with a body. The turning point isn't simply a battle lost. It's the instant Aella becomes what Vikings wanted him to become. Not a king. A prisoner. Because once a ruler is captured, he stops being a symbol of stability, and becomes a symbol of vulnerability. And that is when the real terror begins. Not in the clash of armies. But in the silence afterward, when the victorious decide what kind of death will speak loudest. Capturing a king is like catching a god and dragging him into the mud. It doesn't just remove a leader. It rewires reality for everyone watching. At some point after the fighting around York, the story tightens into its most chilling form. Aella is taken alive. Not killed in the chaos. Not granted the mercy of a quick blade. Taken. Imagine the scene not as a clean surrender, but as a collapse. A king separated from his guard. Pulled from a place he believed was safe. The sounds of battle fading into the heavy breathing of men who have been running for their lives. The stink of sweat and iron. The shock of hands grabbing royal clothing like it's just cloth, because in that moment, it is. Aella would have expected a ransom. That's how noble prisoners often lived. A captured lord was valuable. A captured king could reshape treaties. But the Vikings standing over him weren't calculating his worth. They were measuring his fear. Because this wasn't about money. It was about narrative. Ragnar's sons didn't cross the sea to bargain. They came to rewrite an ending. The humiliation begins with the small things. A king who once sat above others now stands among them. A king who issued commands now receives them. A king who had men kneel now learns what it means to be forced down. They would have marched him through their camp, or through the captured city, letting him see the faces of the men who had come for him. Warriors marked by travel and battle. Leaders who didn't wear crowns but carried authority like a weapon. And somewhere in that crowd, the sons of Ragnar. In saga tradition, Ivar is the mind cold, strategic, almost unervingly patient. Others are the muscle, the storm, the blade. Whether they stood together exactly as told is uncertain. But the image endures because it feels true to the era. A defeated king facing the heirs of the man he allegedly killed. There is a special kind of terror when you realize your death won't be decided by law. It will be decided by people who believe the universe itself demands your suffering. Aella might have tried to speak. Kings always do. He might have offered gold, hostages, land. He might have tried to deny the story of Ragnar. Or justify it. Or mock it. But justification doesn't work against vengeance. Vengeance doesn't listen. It remembers. The Vikings understood something that modern people often forget. Punishment is more effective when it becomes a spectacle people repeat. They wanted Aella's end to travel. They wanted it to cross oceans the way Ragnar's death story did. They wanted it retold in halls, in monasteries, in marketplaces, until even children knew what happened to kings who defied them. So Aella's humiliation wasn't simply personal. It was strategic. If you can break a king publicly, you break the idea of kingship. And once the idea breaks, conquest becomes easier. Towns surrender sooner. Soldiers desert faster. Leaders negotiate from weakness. That is why the capture matters as much as the death. Because between capture and execution, there is a space where the victim understands what's coming. And that space is where fear becomes absolute. Picture Aella at night, bound, guarded, listening. Not to screams, not to violence, but to something worse. Laughter. Feasting. Calm voices discussing his fate like it's already done. Because the Vikings didn't have to rush. Not anymore. Time belonged to them now. And when your enemies own time, they can stretch a moment into an eternity. By dawn, or by whatever day they chose, Aella wouldn't be just a captive. He would be a stage. And Viking history was about to record one of its most infamous finales, an execution that still sparks arguments today, because even the idea of it is terrifying. The most terrifying part of Viking executions isn't that they were violent. It's that they were deliberate. For aella, tradition points to a punishment that has echoed through centuries like a curse: the blood eagle. Historians debate whether it happened exactly as the sagas describe. Some argue it was exaggerated. Some argue it was symbolic language turned literal over time. But here's the truth that matters for this story. People believed it. And belief is powerful enough to shape history. Because whether or not every detail is anatomically accurate, the threat of such an execution, its reputation, was a weapon all by itself. So imagine the scene as the Vikings wanted it remembered. Not a private killing. A controlled spectacle. The air is cold. The ground is hard. Men form a ring: warriors, leaders, onlookers. The sons of Ragnar don't look away. They don't need to. This is the point. Aella is brought forward. He is no longer presented as a king. He is presented as a consequence. There's no dramatic plea that saves him. No last-minute rescue. Because this is not a story about escape. It's a story about inevitability, the kind that makes your stomach drop even before anything happens. The sagas describe an execution meant to mimic something sacred and horrifying at once. An offering. A transformation of the body into an emblem. The name Blood Eagle itself sounds like a myth, but myths are how cultures explain their darkest impulses. We don't need to linger on gore to understand the terror. The terror is in the restraint. In the way an executioner would pause. In the way the crowd would stay quiet. In the way Ælla would realize that even his suffering was being curated. In the Viking worldview, death could be humiliating or glorious. A warrior dying in battle might be honored. A king executed as a spectacle was something else entirely. It wasn't just death. It was discrediting. A message carved into reputation: your power meant nothing in the end. Even if the blood eagle, as literally described, is contested, the broader pattern is not. Viking-age executions and punishments could be ruthless and symbolic, meant to terrify enemies and settle feuds with finality. And in this case, the story's function is clear. Ælla is punished not merely for resisting invasion, but for killing Ragnar in a way that violated honor. Snakes in a pit. So the response becomes legendary. Not just a killing. A legend killing. And when the event ends, the aftermath is almost worse. Because the body is not just mourned and buried quietly. The story is carried outward. It spreads. Monks write fearful accounts of heathens who fear neither god nor king. Survivors whisper about what happens when the Great Heathen Army decides you are not worth a clean death. Other rulers hear the tale and feel their own thrones wobble. That's the impact. Not one dead king. But hundreds of living men suddenly aware that their titles cannot protect them from becoming a lesson. This is how terror becomes policy. You don't have to slaughter everyone. You only have to make an example so unforgettable that everyone else obeys. And whether the blood eagle happened precisely or became magnified through retelling, the Vikings achieved the same result. Ælla's death became a weapon used long after the execution ground was empty. Because in the Viking Age, the dead didn't just disappear. Sometimes, they were recruited. Recruited into fear. King Ælla's end, whether literal in every detail or sharpened into legend, shows the most unsettling truth about Viking history. The most terrifying deaths weren't accidents of war. They were designed. In modern storytelling, we often treat the Vikings like symbols: fearless explorers, brutal raiders, heroic outcasts. But real power in that era wasn't built only by swinging an axe. It was built by controlling the story people told when the fighting stopped. That's why these deaths echo. Because they weren't merely about removing an enemy. They were about rewriting the social order through shock. Think about what it means to execute a king publicly. A king is supposed to be protected by everything: guards, laws, customs, divine approval. If a king can be captured and killed like any other man, then every social promise becomes fragile. The Vikings understood that fragility. They exploited it. And it didn't stop with Ælla. Across Viking history and the cultures they collided with, terrifying deaths served as punctuation marks in political sentences. A rival isn't just defeated, he is degraded. A traitor isn't just killed, he is displayed. An enemy leader isn't just removed, he is turned into a warning. Because fear doesn't require constant violence. Fear requires one unforgettable moment, replayed in the minds of everyone who hears it. That's what the Great Heathen Army truly conquered first.
Not land. Imagination.
They invaded the part of the human mind that calculates risk. They planted the idea that resistance could cost more than life, that it could cost dignity, legacy, even the way your children remember your name. And that is why Aella's death still matters. Not because it's comfortable history, but because it reveals how civilizations can be bent by spectacle. When you hear Blood Eagle, your mind reacts before your logic does. Even if you doubt it, the image still grips you. That is the entire point of such legends. They bypass reason and go straight for the nervous system. And it forces a darker question. If an empire can be built with stories of terror, how many history lessons are actually just carefully crafted threats? Here's the final twist, one that makes Viking history feel uncomfortably modern. Ælla may have died once on the execution ground, but he died a second time in the retelling. Because after the Vikings were done, he wasn't remembered as a complex ruler in a complicated kingdom. He was remembered as the man who killed Ragnar, and as the man who paid for it. That is what terror does.
It edits the past.
It strips people down to a single act, a single punishment, a single warning that fits neatly into a myth. And myths last longer than facts. So when you picture that circle of warriors, that defeated king, that cold air filled with waiting, don't just think about brutality. Think about control. Think about the moment everyone watching understood. Power doesn't always belong to the one with the crown. Sometimes it belongs to the one who decides how you die, and how the world will remember it. Because if the Vikings could make a king's death echo across centuries, what does it take to make your story disappear? And if you lived in a world where reputation was everything, would you choose a quick death in silence? Or a terrifying death that makes you immortal?